to welcome Ray Holloman to speak.
Thanks everyone for having me. I'm excited to be here today and share with you a little bit about what it's like to be trans right now in Tennessee. Sorry, I'm not there in a couple of days ago, so I'm recovering at home, but still wanted to bring this information to you all. So kind of got my bio. The reason I say ish is that I don't actually know how many chickens or quails that I have at any point in time, because I have 4 dogs currently, but we usually have a foster. So that's why it's like 4-ish dogs, because there's 4 permanent dogs here. But I am Ray Holloman. I'm a queer transgender man that lives here in Tennessee. I am chair of the Tennessee Transgender Task Force, and I'm a member of the Vanderbilt LGBTQ Advisory Board, but I'm also a big trans activist and educator in the community, and especially putting a spotlight on that this year, especially with a lot of the bills that have passed or have been going through the legislature. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later of like what has passed, where are things in the process this year that really are impacting the trans community, especially, and a lot of these bills are impacting our trans youth. That's anyone under the age of 18 here in the state of Tennessee. So really going to start off with kind of a roadmap for today is that, you know, what are the issues facing the trans community, not only here in Tennessee, but kind of across the country? What are issues that we continue to see faced? What does trans visibility look like? What are some myths versus facts about trans people? And then at the end, how can we, you know, how can allies be supportive of trans folks? And how can you help us, you know, bring elevation to some of the bad bills that they're trying to be passed this year in our legislature here in Tennessee? Because that's really a big impact of what we're seeing is a lot of stuff's trying to be passed and we're trying to stop it. So I'm going to start with issues just facing the community, facing the trans community overall. And so when we talk about issues facing the community, I really like to start with like these big 4, which is obviously healthcare is a huge impact, but also economics, our safety and our civil rights. Really what we're seeing attacks happen is from all of these different areas. We're seeing our healthcare being attacked. We're seeing our safety being attacked, our civil rights, our ability to be productive in the workplace. We're seeing all of that being impacted this year, and so in each year, and so we're trying to see, you know, these are really big issues that are really trying to help educate people about like how is this impactful to the community. So I like to start off in health. I worked for a healthcare company for 12 and a half years. And so I really got to see kind of the back business side of how healthcare runs. But being someone that transitioned about 7 years ago, I transitioned as an adult. So I did not face a lot of things that a lot of the trans youth face. I was 26 when I transitioned. So it was a little bit different for me. But a lot of these things are still very impactful. The trans population has the highest risk, has one of the higher risks of acquiring HIV infection. And kind of what we've also seen is that the Tennessee Transgender Task Force that I'm a part of, we were funded out of the state up and through December of last year because the health department decided that they wanted to not take any federal money because they didn't want to focus on the target populations that are most likely at risk for HIV, which would be the trans community and people of color. And so really looking at that. Also, a lack of primary care providers. There are not that many providers in the Nashville area or even statewide that are very well versed in transgender healthcare. And so that can make it even harder. get on hormones or figure out how do you get on, how do you manage your health if you don't even have a primary care provider that you can go to. And then obviously health, that includes our mental health. And so being, currently in this state, it's very difficult to think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel because we're constantly just seeing transgender people get piled on day in and day out. And so transgender people have some very high suicide rates because sometimes we just aren't accepted into our communities. And so that can make it very difficult for people to want to live and survive in this state. And so looking at, some statistics, 28% of people are of trans people are refused medical care just due to their identity and expression. And this goes back to, we think about our medical care providers, they are not given a lot of education about how to treat the LGBTQ population. That is growing, but at most they may get, I think I've heard 4 to 6 hours in their 4 years of training. That's not a whole lot unless someone goes and specializes in it. And so you get a lot of people that just refuse. We kind of call it like trans broken arm syndrome. Like, well, you broke your arm because you're trans. And it's like, no, I broke my arm because I was in a car wreck. It had nothing to do with me being trans. So a lot of that refusing is just because somebody identifies as trans. So like, well, I can't treat you. And it's like, but what I'm coming to you for is not even, gender related. People postpone needed medical care because they don't want to be discriminated against, because that's a huge thing. Nobody wants to walk in to an office knowing that they're going to be misgendered or know they're going to be mistreated, or because they could not afford it, because trans people on the whole are woefully underemployed. And so they may not have access to employer-based health insurance compared to like the rest of the population. And so that is one of the things where our health insurance being tied to our, employer makes it difficult, because if you don't have a job, it means that you probably do not have health care insurance if you do have it, and it may be adequate enough for you if you do have it, because a lot of healthcare policies may have an exclusion. It's called um, basically it's like a trans exclusionary policy that says, hey, we are not going to provide transgender services to you because your company like excludes it out of their policy. So there are things like that that continuously always happen. Um, you know, this is also some, statistics about 47% of trans people in the state of Tennessee have reported attempting suicide at some point in their lives. These are the things that, we don't talk about enough, because it's not an easy path to walk down, obviously. And so trying to be able to access all the mental health care that you need and, the physical health care that you need, it's hard, especially if you don't have the insurance and you've got to pay for it all out of pocket. Um, about half of us feel like we have to teach our medical providers about transgender care. That's something that I constantly have to do, is advocate for myself, educate my providers, because they may only see 1 or 2 trans people a year. A lot of times when I go into, like earlier this week, I was having surgery. I'm having to educate myself around that. Also, there's people will respond that, there's professionals such as, we think about uh, people who are trying to do conversion therapy. People are trying to convert people not to be trans, not to be queer. And it's like, this is not okay. But this is the reality, and that a lot of people in the country continue to kind of want to see that and have that happen. So that's where we try to report people from, uh, try to get people to adequate providers that are going to be affirming of their gender identity, versus trying to get them into conversion therapy to get them to live a more deemed accessible life. And so healthcare is something that's very hard in the country for trans people to get. And that all goes back into just the economics of it all. Transgender people are more likely to be in poverty. They're more likely to be on unemployment, homeless, not have as much education. All of these things make it very difficult for a trans person to move up in their life, to be able to have be able to afford their hormones, or to be able to afford to change their documentation. uh, I like to always tell people this fact because it's still just mind blowing to me that Tennessee is the only state that you cannot change the gender on your birth certificate. All the 49 other states, you can change your birth certificate. So for someone like me, that's a Tennessee native, I can't change my birth certificate. So I had to go and get a passport to show that, so that my documentation matches and shows that I have citizenship here. A passport, by the time you're all said and done with it, may cost upwards of $200. But if I was just able to update the gender on my birth certificate, that's a $15 change at the state health department. Those are those kind of barriers that impact people. That's $15 versus $200. What can $200 do for somebody besides just get them documentation to show that, they should be employed and they are the gender that they have stated and have the correct documentation. Um, and just with a lot of discrimination that happens, people don't get jobs, so they become homeless. They may not be able to get as much education. So economics plays a big role in all of, being trans, and especially here in Tennessee, where there are very few, if any, protections for the trans people in the state. And so we look at trans unemployment is at twice the rate of the general population. Uh, and then more than 4 out of 10 people that are currently working are underemployed, which means they are not making enough to sustain themselves. And they're more likely to have a household income under $10,000. And I mean, that's obviously reported income, but that's because if your documentation doesn't match, or you're somewhere where you're going to be in fear for your life every day, it's better to not work than try to go somewhere where you're scared you're going to be hurt or mistreated day in and day out. And so economics plays a big role in that factor. 87% of trans people have experienced harassment or mistreatment on the job. People have lost a job because they were transgender, denied a promotion, or they just flat out were not hired. And I mean, like, this goes back to all transphobia and the bias that we see in the communities. And so we're having to constantly fight against that to try to find jobs that are going to be accepting of our identity, be welcoming and being protective. Because a lot of that goes into, if we don't feel safe at a job, we're not going to probably want to work at that job. If we know we're going to go in and be mistreated day in or day out, it may be easier for somebody to say, oh, I would just rather be homeless, or I will go and do, some under the table work instead. Because nobody, I mean, like, nobody wants to experience harassment on a day in, day out basis. So that's kind of where, you know, there's this economic factor that comes into play of, like, how are we ensuring that our community is employed? And so when we talk about safety for trans people, especially here, there's obviously 2 big factors that play into that. One of that is physical violence. Trans people, especially our trans women of color, are at much higher rates than the general population to have physical violence against them. And there aren't a lot of protections, and sometimes it's not even documented appropriately due to all of those other factors. People get misgendered in the media all the time. And so, just that physical violence piece of, like, going out and being very visible, being very public about who they are, can also lead to a lot of, violence and harm to come towards them. Also, uh, every year in November, we have Trans Day of Remembrance, and the number of trans people, especially trans people of color, that die each year continues to rise because people do not like that these trans people that we exist, that we are happy, that we are comfortable. And so they meet an untimely death because of that. And so a lot of our protection and a lot of our thinking is around, what does our safety look like? How do I know that I'm going to be safe in this location or that location? How do I know that the people that I'm around are safe? And so like constantly have to be vigilant and be on guard to ensure that our safety is first and uh, paramount to like our survival. And so, we have to think about like, can't maybe go to all the different spaces that we want to go to because of potentially a safety impact. And so then we'll go into just talking about kind of in this civil rights. And so one of the things that I talked about a few slides back is documentation. Like I said, if you were born in the state of Tennessee, you cannot change your birth certificate. That's not to say that other states make it easy for you to change your birth certificate, but it is at least doable. There has been a court case against the state, I believe since 2019 or 2020, where quite a few trans people have sued the state to be able to update the gender on their birth certificate, because that's a document that's supposed to reflect us. And so um why why can't we update that document? And so that also comes into play with some other of the proposed bills that are in the state legislature this year that would define sex as what's on your birth certificate and a lot of other things, which basically is more impact to trans people. Also, the impacts of having to deal with law enforcement as a trans person. Not every county, not every municipality deals with trans people in the exact same way. And so you could be like, I'm a trans man. I could end up in a women's prison um, because, I haven't had bottom surgery and things like that. So it's like, we've got to think about that. Also, what about our uh, trans people of color or anybody that's an immigrant trying to come here? What are their rights and what is the other legislation that is impacting them? So, it's saying that trans people, if they end up in jail, they are going to have a much higher rate of physical and sexual assault by staff and other inmates. You're looking at 23% were assaulted by staff and other inmates, and then 1 in 5 was sexually assaulted. And so it's like, these are things that are really impactful to our community. And so, and a lot of times we are some of the people that are most at risk when we go to just even, our existence has become so politicalized that, you've got to be concerned about just going out in public and wonder if you may get stopped for some reason and they find some reason to detain you. Uh, Trans prisoners are obviously more likely to be sexually assaulted. Um, and it's like, this is a problem. And that a lot of that goes back to there's not protection and it's not consistent across the country, across jail, prison. None of it is consistent. So working on that of saying like, how do we make this consistent and how do we try to ensure that trans people who end up in detention are still going to be as safe as possible as someone who obviously does not end up in detention. So from there, that's really a lot of the issues that are a lot of the big broad strokes of the issues that are facing the trans community right now. I mean, health, economics, civil rights, and safety are big things. And a lot of this is coming through because we're seeing a lot more visibility of trans people. I know for myself uh, that have obviously seen an explosion because I like to tell a story that when I was 22 when I first learned about what being trans meant. And so like you got kids that are learning about this at a much younger age. And so they're able to recognize and deal with it better. And so like we're just seeing a lot more visibility on a lot of different fronts that I don't think that we used to typically see. And so like we've had quite a few people that have come out, and that helps all of us. Um, Obviously, Elliot Page, Laverne Cox, Janet, we've helped to normalize it. Sorry about that. Um, we've helped to normalize trans people, that we're just out here, we exist. And so I think that's been very helpful to just see that, like, we're just like everybody else. We're out here working, we're being productive, we're providing back to society. And that's one of the things that I try to do. I try to be uh, very visible so people know that, that I exist, that I'm out here, and have this life experience that I do, that I spent 26 years of my life as a female, and I've spent the last almost seven, having transitioned. And so it just gives me a different perspective on the world when you can see both of those. Um, and so, like, while it's becoming more visible in mainstream media, like, I mean, shows where you're seeing trans people be, not necessarily just like a token character, but just being seen like somebody is like a main part of the cast. There has also been an increase for more violence. And there's also obviously a lot more murders that are happening. Um, Obviously, there were more committed last year than any year prior. They mostly affect trans women of color. Uh, but visibility is not the only thing that we need. We need, increased inclusion. We need to be a part of all spaces, all parts of this, like, so, of the progressive movement, like, be embraced by the feminist movement, the anti-racist, trade unions. We have to be a part of it because we are a part of it. We are a part of all of these different communities. And so we need to be able to struggle with the rest of the movement, show our visibility, show how we can, show how it impacts us as much as it impacts them. Because it's like we're, and like, trans people are also people of color. There's trans women. We work, so all of these things, reproductive justice, all of these things, trans people kind of have to be highlighted, not highlighted, but need to be included in all of these parts of the movement, because it is so important. I think one of the big things that we also have been seeing a lot more, and there's a lot more bills that we see around, especially the trans athletes. And so I think this is an important part to bring up, is that, they are just trying to compete, and they have to go through so much testing, and their levels have to be at such a place where they can do it. And so it's like, this is, like, a lot of times they are taking significant hits to their performance to be able to compete. And so I think that we have to recognize that everybody should be allowed to play sports and do what they choose to do. And so I think these are two really good examples of people that have gone to that Division 1 level as trans people and have competed. And so that's just another way that we're starting to see that more visibility come from, like, the media into the sports world, and just making it more normalized. I think that's been the biggest thing that I've seen, is that it's just become more normalized over the last few years, even though there's bills every year that are trying to ban trans people from playing sports. We're also seeing more trans athletes come out, uh, and being able to compete in the category that they should be competing in. So with that, just want to do a quick, like to do some myths versus facts, just to kind of get people thinking about the trans community overall. And so we're gonna go through this next section and see kind of what everyone's thinking. So, um, you know, all of these things up here, trans women are just gay men in drag, and like, that is a complete that is not true. Like, trans women are women. They're not gay men. And so, yes, there are trans women who do drag, but there's also a lot of gay men who love to dress up and perform. And so you can't just say that they're all just gay men in drag. Um, Trans men are women pretending to be men. There is no pretending there. Uh, Trans men are men. Non-binary people are non-binary. Like however somebody identifies, that's who they are. And so I don't think that we can uh take that away from anybody as saying that like, well, you can't say that there's something else. Like we have to go based upon what people identify themselves as. Uh, all transgender people are homosexual, just like gender expression, gender identity is a spectrum, sexual orientation is a spectrum. So you may have trans people that are straight, you may have trans people that are gay or queer or sit somewhere along that line, but they're not all homosexuals. Um, Trans people are sex workers. Now, there is a great percentage of trans people that have participated in sex work. Um, Somewhere around 12% have participated in sex work, but that goes back to the economics of it all. If you don't have documentation, sometimes you know, we have to survive in this capitalist culture that we're in. And so trans people are, just trying to find employment. So yes, there are some that are sex workers, but there are many that are not either. Not to say that there's anything wrong with sex work at all, but just saying that like not all trans people are sex workers. And then the last one is that, do all trans people want to have sex reassignment surgery, so-called bottom surgery or anything like that? Again, trans people are not a monolith. Uh, Everybody expresses their identity very differently. Some people, that's what that's what their ideal is, and some people just change their name and pronouns and are comfortable with just binding or wearing prosthetics. And so every trans person's experience is going to be different. What they want is going to be different. I always tell people, it's like, if you wouldn't ask that question to your grandma, don't ask it to a trans person. There's Google out there. There's things like this that help educate, but like, it's like it's not a lot of times it's not an appropriate question to ask of trans people, especially if you don't know them that well. Um, and so not everybody wants to have um, reassignment surgery. Not everybody wants to go on hormones. That's another big thing that everybody, must go onto gender affirming hormone treatment. That's another thing that some people do, but some people don't. And so each person's experience is going to look very different based upon what they see for themselves. And I think that's the important piece, is that we have to start looking at, like we do with everybody, looking at the person and seeing what they want for themselves, not with the expectations that we have for them. All right. So getting into the kind of the live section that I have, um, and then we'll be able to probably take some questions if people have them. But really it's about, how can you support trans people? How can you support trans folks, especially in the state of Tennessee, especially where we are right now? How can we all, how can there be better allies? How can you be better accomplices? And how can you help us, just ensure that we are getting the visibility that we need and that our voices aren't being silenced? So how can you be a better ally? It's I use this a lot for when I'm talking to healthcare providers, but I think it really works well, is that make sure you create a welcoming environment. I think that is so important to people to feel welcome, because if they feel welcome, they're more likely to be relaxed, and so that will make the interactions easier on both sides. If you're unsure of a person's name or pronoun, just ask, um, and use this name and pronouns even when they aren't in front of you. A lot of times I'll just go up and introduce myself, be like, hey, my name is Ray. I use he, him pronouns. What's your name and pronouns? Just something very quick, because that way I know that I am being respectful full of them, and knowing that I'm going to use the right pronouns for them, because that is such an important part of ensuring that you're respecting somebody, um, and what they, and who they are. Also, don't disclose anybody's status to anyone who doesn't need to know the information. For the most part, people really shouldn't need to know the person's past. It should be on, if that trans person wants to disclose that information to that person, then obviously they will. But otherwise, that person doesn't necessarily need to know about that person's past. And so that's one of the things that we have. So there is no reason to really disclose a person's past, to someone who didn't know them before. Um, I talk about my past a lot, but not everybody does. Not everybody's comfortable with their past. And so that is something that, just be aware of, is like saying, especially if you knew them in the past, it's like, ask them, are they comfortable with you using, talking about past experiences? A lot of it's just about consent, asking before you do anything that could potentially impact them. Um, I really see that, we have two big days, Ability, which was at the end of March, and then Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is in November. Those are two big days that, trans people are really uplifted, or supported, or remembering them. But I really think that it's, you know, treat trans people like you would want to be treated. It's not a person's entire identity to be trans. Yes, I'm trans, but I also farm, I also garden, I also work in IT, I do disaster recovery, I do a lot of volunteering. Like, I do a lot of different things. Being trans is really a lot of times just a small part of my identity. I like to tell people, when I transition, the biggest things that happened was that my name and pronouns changed. Those were the two big things that really happened. Still wore the same clothes, still acted very similarly. I gained some facial hair, but like, I didn't have a lot of big changes. Um, but don't ask anything that you wouldn't be comfortable answering yourself. Like, if you're not comfortable answering that question, then maybe you shouldn't be asking that of somebody else. Um, and obviously, it's okay to make mistakes. The biggest thing to do is, when you make a mistake, correct it really quickly, especially with the pronoun. If you say he when you should have said she, be like, sorry, she, and move on. Like, you don't have to make a big spectacle out of it and over apologizing. Just make a quick apology and just move on, because you want to make sure that it doesn't become bigger than it really needs to be, because we know that this thing, it takes time. But obviously, coming to things like this, taking your time, learn and to implement the best practices, so that way you can be more aware. And obviously, there's so many resources online and in the community. um, I'm one of these people, like, utilize me as a resource. I don't mind talking about this stuff. I love educating people about this. And so, like, I will give people tips on, how could this interaction have been better, or what you could have done differently. And then, so, just like, tips for supporting trans people that are in your life. Um, it's not easy for a person to come out and say that they are trans, or even queer, have it be anything different than, what we consider the norm at this point. So always lead with that open mind, no matter, because you never know where that person is in their journey. It's very difficult a lot of times to come out to people. And so, yes, it's, maybe hard for you to receive that information, but it may also be hard for them to provide that information. So think about that. Obviously, give them the opportunity to open up, share their thoughts and feelings, allow for there to be space, and actually listen to them and listen to what they're saying, because you may really learn a lot about them, um, through that. And if at first you can't be overtly supportive because we know that it can be difficult and it is a change. That subtle support, like, like maybe just, you know, popping up a trans flag in your background or, just saying, hey, I'm here for you, things like that. That is so very helpful um, to show that subtle support. Also, learning the language is a great way to have those important and sometimes it's hard, difficult conversations because our language, especially in this space, I feel like fluctuates a lot and it changes. And so, like, you kind of constantly have to stay on top of like what are the best terms for, to be saying, and so it's like learning those terms and making sure that they're still the correct terms you should be using. Also, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, you know, it's all a process. So make sure that you are taking the time to, you know, be very intentional about it. This is not something that you have to flip and change overnight. You can do this over time, but making sure you're addressing your reactions and moving forward, it can take that time. But would rather that than, there be this over explosion of acceptance and then you backtrack it. Small steps make a big difference as well. Also, we all make mistakes. We all do. We're going to learn from them. We're going to learn from them together. We're going to learn to move on. And I think that's the important piece is that you're going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect. I'm I'm by far no means any kind of perfect in doing this. Um, and so I'm always constantly still learning and making sure that, the language that I'm using is reflective of the broadest part of the community as I can. And so we're gonna make mistakes, but we're gonna learn from them, and that's gonna be okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk about in this presentation, I wanted to talk about some of the current proposed bills that are in front of the legislature right now. And then I will talk about some of the laws that have passed this year, just as we start kind of wrapping up a little bit. Basically, House Bill 1269, Senate Bill 466, that would give the license to teachers to be able to misgender students in school, which is a school's already rough, and if you are a trans kid in school, going to school and your teachers having the ability to misgender you because they don't agree, because they don't like how you identify, it just seems very, since a really bad message to our students when it's already been hard to get students back in, especially after the COVID years, and get them up. It's like we're going to now let teachers really become the bullies of these students as well. Um, so that one's currently in the legislature. It's currently, I believe it's behind the budget for this year, but that one's coming. Um, House Bill 1319, Senate Bill 918, the right to fly flags. So they are trying to make it where it would be illegal to fly any other flags except for like the United States flag, the Tennessee state flag, and I think a couple others. So like campuses that fly like the pride flags or anything else, like that could become illegal. And so how does that take away from our ability to, express ourselves, be able to raise the flags? And so a lot of these are really attacking like our First and Second Amendment. Well, not Second Amendment, but our First Amendment to be able to express ourselves. And so that's what this bill is doing here. Uh, on the third one on the top, House Bill 727, Senate Bill 1443. This is a parent opt-in bill. There's been similar bills like it that have passed, but this one is targeting gener- uh, GSAs and sex education in schools. And so that's a big impact because we want to ensure that students are basically, that means that the student would have to come out to the parent before they could participate in a GSA. or before they can participate in sex education. We are already in an abstinence only state for sex education. So this is just another target to basically say, hey, we're not going to talk about the, like the LGBTQ population unless you give us explicit permission to talk about it in front of your student. And so it allows for parents to be able to opt in and opt out of that. Uh, House Bill 306, Senate Bill 1237, that's trying to ban trans athletes and participating in state sanctioned sports. There's already a bill that's passed, I think, for public schools, and they're trying to pass one for the private schools as well. But that's obviously another big impact on really just focusing and targeting a lot of our attention on the trans community, the LGBT community overall. And I would say that for the majority of these bills that I have up here, they impact the youth. So they impact people under the age of 18. Which, and they obviously have the least amount of voice, if we think about it, because they can't vote. And so like we are really impacting them. Uh, House Bill 1379, Senate Bill 1044, that's gender diverse accommodations in camps. So that's looking at how to, when a kid goes to a camp, what bathroom do they go to if they're trans? Trying to police all of these different items through there. And so a lot of these bills are really impacting the youth. I didn't list here for House Bill 1215, Senate Bill 1339, but this is actually, this bill impacts not only people in the state of Tennessee, but would impact people across the entire nation if it passes. So House Bill 1215, this is one that I have gone up to the House and actually testified against. It is a bill that would be for TennCare, that if you want to be a managed care organization that provides the TennCare contracts, you cannot reimburse for gender affirming services, not only in the state of Tennessee, but anywhere in the entire country. So if we think about who are our managed care organizations right now for TennCare, we have Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, and Amerigroup. And so in other states, there have been bills that have passed that say to be a managed care provider for us, you have to reimburse for gender affirming care. And so it's going to raise us into conflict with a lot of different things. And the thing is that TennCare already does not do gender affirming surgeries. They barely pay for hormones and lab work for people that need them, transgender or non-binary. And so it's just like trying to now control the insurance companies in a way. And so it's like really getting people to look at this and saying like the overreach is going so far into now health insurance, which means that if we can't find a managed care organization to do our TennCare administration, then that means that TennCare has to switch to a fee-for-service model, which will actually more expensive for the state to run than it is today. And so this bill has been bouncing back and forth. It's passed through the House. It's been stuck in the Senate committee, so will not pass out this year. But it's something to keep an eye on in the different ways that they are going back to talking about, health, economic, safety, and civil rights. How are they going back and attacking those in different ways? All of these bills are attacking those things: health, or civil rights, or safety, economics. It's impacting all of these things because if you can't, if you're on TennCare, to be on that level, like you don't have the finances, and so that impacts your economics. And so it's thinking about how are they like systematically trying to break down transgender people so that we do not exist. One other bill that I want to bring up that I think is really important to know about, and this goes along with when I was talking about our birth certificates, and is that it's House Bill 239, Senate Bill 1440, which is the definition of sex. So it basically turns the definition of sex to be something that is inchangeable, cannot, you cannot change it. The problem is that, and so like what's on your birth certificate has to, the way it's kind of written is that what's on your birth certificate has to match what's on your driver's license. That's a problem because, like, for me, I've been able to update my driver's license. So my driver's license says male, but my birth certificate still says female. And so if you put those in place along with, so you have that part of it, but then you also have, we start talking about some of the bills that have passed these years, these things start getting in combination with each other. You could say it really starts to look like they target out onto trans people for these different proposed bills. And so they're trying to figure out how can they eliminate our existence, through documentation, through laws, through bills. And that's what we have really been seeing. And so that's another one that uh, may potentially pass out this year. Uh, the legislative session is coming up to an end. So we'll see. But if it doesn't pass this year, it'll probably be back next year for sure. But just knowing, and the greatest thing about, I gave you all these numbers because if you put in like HB 1269 TN into like Google, it'll bring you up to the exact bill and you can see where it is in progress with each other. And I think that's a really good tool for everybody to know, is that like you can see where these bills are at, what they are doing, are they passing, who is passing them, who is voting for these bills. That way you can contact your representatives and say, hey, why are we passing this? This isn't helpful to Tennesseans. This is hurting Tennesseans. So why are we passing it? So two new laws that have passed this year that have really impacted the trans community. One is I just have the Senate bill numbers up here. So uh, Senate Bill 1, which was the trans youth healthcare ban. And so that makes it to where providers can no longer, basically, it forces anybody under the age of 18 that is on gender affirming services to detransition by next year. And so that means that if you had a kid that's 15 and they were on gender affirming hormones, they cannot be prescribed hormones any longer in the state of Tennessee. And then off of that by, I think it's either July or March of next year. Um, that's a really big thing because we've already blocked puberty blockers, and now we're blocking, this life-saving care that these students, these youth, they really do need. And so it's like, what does that look like? In the state of Tennessee, prior to this bill even passing, only 6 providers or institutions that serve the trans youth population. You basically had 2 in probably each region of the state, 2 in East, 2 in Middle, 2 in West. Um, that's not a lot of people. This goes back to access to healthcare, reducing that access. And so a lot of these providers, even before the bill goes into effect July 1, but a lot of them have already stopped or have been transitioning their patients out to other states, to other providers, so they can still get their health care, because we know how life-saving this is. But not everyone can afford a trip, to Ohio or to a state where they can get health care. For the longest time, we thought that, Kentucky would be a pretty decent option for a lot of people in the state, but they've also passed their own bill this year uh, for banning trans youth healthcare. The governor vetoed it, but the legislature overrode it, and so it became law. And so we're gonna have to, you know, as a community, I feel like we all come together to like ensure. And so it's like really making sure that the youth knows that we're here for them, that we're fighting for them. That's one of the things that I continually, when I talk to them, it's like, like I know that all of this stuff sucks and you shouldn't have to be dealing with it. There's there's a few people that don't think that you deserve to like have the healthcare that you need, but like letting them know that we're still here for them. Because really all this ban does is it transitions the, you know, the healthcare, like gender affirming services, going to the doctor, seeing them, to potentially them having to end up um, becoming very suicidal and harming themselves. And so then what is that health impact on them long term? So it's really trying to balance both of those type things. So there's been no stays in this bill. It's currently going into effect July 1. So anybody that it hasn't been on hormones won't be able to get on hormones, and anybody that was on hormones that won't turn 18 before then will have to come off of them or find other ways to put through those hormones. And so I've been seeing a lot of there are some grants out there, some emergency grants out there that are there to help fund people for transportation to get out of state, because in some parts of the state it may be pretty far drive to get somewhere to get access to that healthcare and find a new provider. Um, the other one that has passed is the anti-drag bill. Um, Obviously, I've seen a lot of people protest that bill, be down at the Capitol for that as well. And that really impacts the drag performers, but because it is written so vaguely that it could impact trans people overall, because it could see that uh, trans people are being like a trans man as being a male impersonator. So like, and so like they don't want that to be in front of, anybody under the age of 18. That's where it goes back to that, how some of these bills work in conjunction with each other. That definition of sex bill, in conjunction with this anti-drag bill, could make it very difficult for trans people to go out into public and to just even just exist. I know that I've had to rethink about some of the things that I do because I do a lot of volunteering uh, out in the community. It's like, well, how does this impact me if I'm going and talking to a student about IT, cybersecurity, what I do for my day job? What if I'm talking to them about that, and then they go home and they Google me and they see also all the trans stuff that I do? Am I going to potentially be able to catch a charge because they're going to be like, I was promoting, you know, was I in the on the wrong side of the law with this? So there's a lot of things that we have to think about. Fortunately for this bill, though, we have had a couple of stays. It was supposed to go into effect April 1st. There's been a couple of stays, so now it looks like sometime in May, if it doesn't keep getting deferred, because it does go against some of our, institutional rights that we have. And so it has passed this year. There's obviously, once it goes into effect, there's going to be lawsuits around like talking about what that looks like. But it's just, I think it's just looking at like systematically, how are they going about our community? How are they trying to break down all of our connection points? How are they trying to break down how we are in community with each other? Because I mean, like a lot of times people go to drag performances to be in community with other queer people, to support other queer people, things like that. So it's like, how are they trying to break it down so like we aren't as tightly connected anymore? So those are the kind of things that like I'm thinking about. These are laws that have been passed. Some more of these that were on the previous slide maybe passed this year or next year, as we've seen over the last week or so. The legislature has really taken a turn towards gun control, which I think is uh, a great thing, because obviously gun violence impacts a lot of people in this community as well. And so how do we, ensure, safety, but how are we also making sure that these laws do not also woefully over impact the trans community? Because that's one thing that I worry about with like the red flag laws, is that how some of this stuff is written could impact the trans community, because they may see trans people as a risk. So there are both sides to it. So some resources that I just want to leave you all with, just about trans stuff in person. Um, like I said at the top, I'm the chair of the Tennessee Transgender Task Force. We are a task force of all trans identified people across the state of Tennessee. Uh, we were out of the Department of HIV Prevention and Surveillance through December of last year when the state decided to stop funding us. But now we are switching. We are still going to exist, but we're going to exist as more just a healthcare entity overall. So we we have a resource guide. We put out infographics, so you can find us on Instagram. Um, as we're trying to rebuild our platform. Obviously, there's the Trans Money Program at Vanderbilt. That's a great resource, even because they will get you connected to, healthcare providers in your area. Tennessee Equality Project, for stuff going on at the legislature. Listen, especially for the K through 12 students. That's a great institution. And then ACLU obviously has our back when it comes to lawsuits. And then Inclusion Tennessee is basically trying to build a table for all of these different community partners to come to be resourced, to have resources to promote events. And so I uh, really like what they're doing, especially with all the rallies and stuff, is really leaning in and trying to grab all the parts of the communities together, make sure that we're all talking to each other, we can support each other's events and things like that. So um, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you want to send me an email and chat more, I'm always available to answer questions, anything like that. But I just want to thank you all for bearing with me, bearing with my voice today, and allowing me to kind of tell you about what it's kind of like to be trans in Tennessee right now, especially with the political landscape that we're facing.